Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'd like to start by saying I'm very proud to have been born in the land of the Ngāi in Aotearoa. Very grateful to live in the beautiful lands of the Wurundjeri in the Yarra Valley, and pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Councillor Fiona McAllister, Mayor of Yarra Ranges Council, and very pleased to be welcoming you to tonight's virtual session. Are we there yet? Getting through things or getting there together. Like to also welcome the Deputy Mayor, Councillor David Easton, who's here with us, and any other councillors who may be zooming in. And of course, thank the Yarra Ranges Council staff, Linda and the team, Brendan and others who are bringing us tonight's session. And of course, clinical psychologist David Younger, who's our facilitator for tonight's session. I don't think I need to tell any of you who are joining us tonight how difficult the past 18 months have been. As a parent of young children, I have actually children at both ends of the spectrum, young children, grade 1 and grade 3, and I have a daughter in year 12. And I've always thought of myself as a pretty resilient person. I think I probably still do, and I'm sure most of us think that of ourselves. But I have to say that the past 18 months have been the most difficult times I've been through. The challenges of homeschooling, juggling the roles of work and mum and counsellor, and trying to find space for myself and my family and my team at work, council. The juggle has been exhausting. And there have been days where it has been incredibly difficult and days where it's all been fine. And none of us anticipated we would be having these conversations now. So are we there yet? Feels like the mantra of every day, and feels like a wonderful title for tonight. And I think pausing to be okay with not being okay, and to listening to wonderful people like David share insights and advice with us is a really important thing. So we're here tonight to talk about meeting the needs of parents and carers and families in the community who, like me, are trying to juggle a lot, trying to cope with what is, again, our day-to-day, and I'm not going to use the word normal because it still doesn't feel normal, and thinking, how do I get the balance right? And maybe, you know, am I being a good parent? Am I being a good partner? Am I being a good employee? Am I being a good counsellor? All of the questions that run through all of our minds. So wonderful to have David here to talk with us today. So David's an expert in natural disasters and emergencies. He's worked with communities across Victoria and the wider country, and we've been grateful to have his support on many occasions at Yarra Ranges Council. He's a member of the Education Department's Trauma Recovery Team and is on the advisory panel of Melbourne University's Children in Disasters Group. So he's here with us tonight to share some information on how to take care of yourself and those around you. And there'll definitely be time for questions. So we'd really encourage you at any point. There's a Q&A. If you hover your pointer down the bottom of your screen, if you're on a computer or a laptop, you'll see Q&A. Just pop your questions in there, and we'll pause a couple of times in tonight's session to answer those questions. We will be recording tonight. We are already, but I'd just like to reassure you that it will only be myself and David who will be on that recording, and we did want to make that available for anyone else who wanted to watch it, so it'll be on Council's recovery site as well. We'll upload it there. I do understand the sensitivity of talking about how you're feeling. Mental health feels very vulnerable, and so everyone is welcome to contribute to the chat, to contribute your questions, and of course your privacy will be absolutely respected. But we're very appreciative of you joining us here tonight for what feels like an incredibly important but very useful session. So welcome, David, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Councillor McAllister. Thank you to the broader Yarra Rangers team that have contributed to this evening's session. And of course, thank you to all of you out there who've taken time out of your Thursday evening to tune into this. I really hope that I can share some useful information with you that will contribute to your ongoing experience, to your experiences over the coming months and maybe years. I'd like to also begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm gathered, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So this is really an opportunity, next hour and a half or so, to just stop for a moment, create a bit of time and space to reflect on things. And think about what has been occurring. Within that, I'll be sharing information with you. I'd like you to, as much as you can, ask questions. And amidst all of this, I hope that we can build some common or shared understanding and meaning, because one of the many things that's well understood in the natural disaster recovery world and in the recovery from emergencies, and the pandemic is a health emergency, is that these sorts of events cause a lot of disruption, unsettle life, they cause a lot of stress, and they preoccupy us generally with a lot of additional activities that we might not be familiar with at all, or have no prior experience on. And with that preoccupation comes a taking away of attention from ourselves. In other words, we tend to focus on what's occurring outside of us and lose contact with ourselves, or just become less familiar with what the important priorities are in life that may have been, in fact, a very important priority a few weeks earlier, or a few months earlier, or a year earlier. So this is also an opportunity to come back into contact with yourselves and just think about what's occurring for you, and perhaps start to formulate a bit of a plan for the next 3 to 12 months. I just want to mention in this as well that, and Councillor McAllister touched on this, but there's the potential that things might come up for you emotionally or otherwise as you're sitting there in your room listening to some of this and thinking about things. And I want to reassure you that that's okay. That's just all part of being human. But at the very end of this session, there'll be a slide that appears with the names and contact numbers of 3 services that, if you feel there's a need, you can reach out to and connect with. Now, without further ado, I'm going to move on, but I want to just let you know that I'll divide the session up into 2 halves, essentially. So the first part of my discussion is really going to focus on creating a context to help us all understand why we may be feeling the way we're feeling at the moment, or why maybe we're experiencing some of the challenges and the difficulties, and some of the common ones. Councillor McAllister was mentioning there herself when she was talking about some of her personal experiences. There'll then be a short Q&A section. We'll then come back to the second part of the discussion, where I'll take a bit more of a deep dive into particular approaches or strategies and techniques for support, whether that's parents supporting themselves, or supporting youth or children, or families, how families can support each other, and any other carers out there as well. And then we'll come back to another Q&A. So I wonder, if you cast your minds back, it might seem like an eternity ago, but in 2019-20, at summer period, there were, of course, Black Summer bushfires, which occurred all up and down the East Coast. And I'm starting out this way because I just really want to highlight that there hasn't been just one main event that has impacted and affected people in our community. In fact, there has been a number of events. And when there are a number of events, there can be a cumulative impact. And whilst those fires might not have directly impacted the Yarra Rangers, they were probably quite confronting for a significant proportion of us. But before we really had too much of a chance to think too much about them, the pandemic had arrived and was on our doorstep. And COVID, of course, was unexpected, unfamiliar. I don't think any of us have ever experienced a pandemic previously, and really it's turned normal life upside down. But this is also something that natural disasters and emergencies are well known at doing. So we started to come into contact with a lot of stress, a lot of disruption and stress, and by now many people are starting to feel very tired and fatigued. The pandemic is, of course, very much ongoing, and although some of us, or many of us, are hopefully starting to catch a glimmer of some light at the end of the tunnel, not too far off in the distance, even the last few days have been quite unsettling for many, and there is still quite a bit of uncertainty about what's actually going to come over the coming months and as we move into 2022. I'm also very much aware, and being a person that lives in a rural area, that the next summer season is on our doorstep, or will be shortly, and many of us will be facing bushfire risk again. And there has also additionally been the severe weather event in June. So cumulatively impacting events, significant events, sometimes can lead to, or quite often can lead to, significant additional challenges and difficulties. It's important also to say that these sorts of events and the way in which people experience them doesn't all occur in the same way. In other words, people have a tendency to experience these sorts of events in their own unique way. And although there are common themes that exist amongst the way in which people, adults, children, youth, react and respond, there are also very often big differences. And so you can have, for example, a family going through the same event, experiencing COVID or experiencing a severe weather event, but reacting and responding differently and not understanding why that's the case. So when we move to the second section of tonight, I'll, as I said or mentioned, drill down a little bit into the detail in regard to how to understand these sorts of things, but also how to support people the best. Now, in terms of the reasons for people responding differently to events, well, these are many and varied, but some of the key reasons that people respond differently are their age, their personality, which is unique to the person, their stage of development, which I know is a bit of a technical word, but I guess we use that word when we talk about children, teenagers. Life experience is another big one. Adults, of course, have the benefit of multiple life experiences generally, and sometimes, or quite often, what they've learned through those life experiences to be able to draw on. And then they, by drawing on that, can apply that knowledge and understanding to a new experience, which may be, well, one that they haven't had before. But teenagers and children often aren't able to do that. So they respond and react to events differently. There's also the extent to which people have supports in place, the amount of support that they have in their life. And these are, to name just a few. Now, then if we're to start to think about and talk about the way in which we can view the effects on people, whether that is, or whether they are adults, members of a family, children, or teenagers, there are a few different ways that we can do this. And I want to just mention three to you, although one of them in particular I'm going to focus on. The first is in reference to a term that has been becoming a little bit more common over the recent months in the context of COVID and extended lockdowns, and that is of lockdown fatigue. It's a term that probably appeared a little over 6 months ago or so, and it is, as the name suggests, fatigue associated with lockdowns and the restrictions or the disconnection from being able to be involved in normal activities in life, and to a certain extent, the normal routines and the normal rhythms of life that hold a healthy, meaningful, balanced life together. So lockdown fatigue is in fact a kind of a global term, a sort of an umbrella term that's used to refer to a range of different experiences that people have, but essentially tiredness and a fatigue, a lethargy, a being over it all, just wanting it all to stop, and perhaps just wanting it all to go back to normal. There is, of course, also the mental health lens. And thank goodness over the last 10 to 15 years, the stigma surrounding mental health challenges and difficulties has really started to be broken down. But when we talk mental health challenges, perhaps common terms or words that will come to mind will be things like anxiety or depression or sleep problems or substance use. And so mental health issues are another lens through which we can start to view and understand the impact of COVID and lockdowns and an uncertain future. But I do just want to stress that not everybody who experiences lockdown fatigue, or not everybody that is experiencing some sort of other challenge or difficulty associated with COVID and the pandemic and everything that's going on, has a mental health difficulty or challenge. But having said all of that, it is now also well identified that for many people who were experiencing a mental health difficulty prior to the pandemic, that has, for a certain proportion of people, become worse. And then there were those people that weren't experiencing a mental health difficulty that now are. There's then a third way in which, and this is the area that I want to focus a little bit more on, a third way in which we can look at the effect or the effects and why we're starting to feel the way we're feeling in the context of COVID. And so, in fact, there are 6 key terms, or I guess 6 key points that I'm going to mention here and just talk to briefly before I then touch on, as we head into the questions, some of the really important things to begin to focus on. So these 6 key effects that I want to mention, 5, are disruption to normal life, changed assumptions about what is normal and our normal life. I want to then mention loss and the varying types of loss that can occur for people across the age ranges and across the lifespan. Then mention the role of stress, and then talk about reactions and responses. And in that, I'm just going to unpack a little bit about children and how we can keep an eye out for what's happening with them. So if we think about this, if we can cast our minds back to 18 months ago, and we do use that term normal life, we can start to think of a life that was pretty routine and was pretty stable. And that we could do a whole series of things in that life, whether that was get the kids ready for school, get up and get ready for work and go into the office in the time when we worked in offices and weren't working remotely, head off to a job, take the kids to the park, do all those various things, wide-ranging things that we tended to enjoy and get good meaning out of. The thing is, with natural disasters and emergencies, and this has absolutely been the case with the pandemic, the disruption that's come about due to not only lockdowns, but various other restrictions, has upset the natural flow of routines, and in upsetting the natural flow of routines, has brought about instability and a lack of predictability. So it's no longer the case that you can wake up in the morning and as easily or as automatically as it once was, follow a routine. It's tending to take a bit more effort and energy these days to juggle the various competing priorities and to think about what it is you actually need to get through in a day, or to think about, in fact, what the priorities are. Now, of course, I don't know what the experience was for all of you out there that are tuned in tonight, but when I think back to the first lockdown that we had here in Victoria, and then that more extended one, right at the beginning, I think some people, and I'm certainly not saying everybody, found it or experienced it in a way that enabled them to just have a little bit of a break, slow down a little bit. So absolutely, I'm stressing that this definitely wasn't the case for everybody. But there was something novel about it, and maybe we didn't really recognise the true risk or the true threat at the time. And so we kind of went with it, I think. But as time went on, and particularly as that second lockdown extended, and then certainly as we came into this year and there were more lockdowns, many people started to, it seemed, change their view of what's normal. And this is what we refer to as changing assumptions about normal life. because this other thing or this other characteristic of normal life is that we base our view on what's normal upon assumptions about what we expect to happen. I just expect that I'll be able to take the kids to school, or I just expect that I'll be able to get up and go to work, or I just expect that any disruption to my life or to the family's life won't be ongoing for 6 months or won't be ongoing for 12 months. And it's certainly not going to be ongoing for 18 months. But here we are. And so that brings into question what is normal. And once that comes into question, generally people start to feel quite uncertain about what lies ahead. And of course, some of the messaging that's coming through is that we're not necessarily going back to a complete normal. We'll be moving forward into something that's a little bit different. And that can be quite challenging and confronting. But I'm going to touch on this a little bit more in the second part of the session also, and just make some suggestions about how we can, as best as is possible, come to terms with this and work with it and move forward in a way that is actually healthy and supportive of people in our lives. So disruption to normal life and then changed assumptions about normal life. Thirdly, loss, and loss of varying types. I'm again sure that many of you out there are already aware of the losses that you've experienced and continue to experience in life. But one very important point is that we can never be entirely certain about about the sort of loss or the types of loss that other people are experiencing, unless they tell us about it, or unless we ask them and have a conversation about their experience. And this is because loss is something that is unique to the individual and is wide-ranging. So if I lose my job, of course, that's a type of loss. But what will come with that will inevitably be financial impact and stress. And that in turn might lead to other losses. Not being able to go to school and connect with my friends, of course, that's a type of loss, albeit temporary. Not having the routine or the predictability and stability of attending school is another type of loss. Perhaps friendships change, and of course through lockdown and the social disconnection that's come from that, there may well have been changes in what were once quite close relationships, or not having spoken to important people for quite some time, which can be another type of loss as well. And so it's just important to stop and begin to recognize what sort of losses you've experienced. And as we start to move forward into the rest of the year and next year, give consideration to which losses you might be able to reconnect with, but perhaps there'll be some there that you might not be able to bring back into your life. And that would be okay, because there will inevitably be experiences that we have that come out of the pandemic that are really quite significant. Fourthly, I want to just touch on stress and mention stress, which I guess is a relatively common everyday term that's used. But to be a little bit more specific about it, it's important to mention that there are different types or different levels of stress that we can go into. So on the one hand, there's having no stress in your life at all. But then if we sort of move up a little bit, there's everyday stress or normal stress, which usually is fine, as long as it doesn't go on for too long and as long as it doesn't become too intense. But above normal everyday stress is what we call protracted stress, or a bit more commonly, endurance mode. And endurance mode is something that we also talk quite commonly about within the natural disasters and emergencies area, because whenever you experience one of these events, you no longer have the usual everyday activities or just the usual everyday activities to contend with and be involved in. There's quite typically another layer that is put over the top. And of course, the other layer that's over the top at the moment is supporting children with homeschooling, working from home, juggling those sorts of things, plus the disconnection from important people in our lives. Now, the human body and mind are incredibly adaptive, and if I say they do the best that they can to help us when things get tough and challenging. And the way they do that is to adapt and to take us into this slightly heightened state of stress, which actually is fueled or driven by a particular chemical that's released into the bloodstream called cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone that gives us access to energy that we wouldn't otherwise get access to. Unless you go through a period or a phase in your life where you've got a lot of challenges that you need to contend with, you probably won't go into endurance mode. But I know that most of you out there will have already entered into this state at some point in your life prior to the pandemic. But the pandemic has pushed many, many people up into this endurance state, which is also okay for a relatively short period of time. But one of the problems with it is, or the risk is, that over time, it depletes the body of energy, and can lead to health challenges and difficulties, whether they're physical or psychological and emotional. This is also one of the reasons that people are feeling quite tired and fatigued at the moment. You know, aside from it being difficult to do things like disconnect at the end of the day or decompress at the end of a week, it's this constant doing things with the overhanging uncertainty about what's going to happen. And that has the tendency to keep people, adults, as well as younger people, in this heightened state of stress. So this is why it then starts to become really important at this point to start to check in with ourselves and those around us to gain an awareness of where we're at this point in time. You know, do I really need to stop and start to think about how I can replenish energy reserves in my body? Or if I've still got some energy there in the tank, in the fuel tank or in the reserve tank, maybe I need to really think now about how I'm going to preserve it and make sure it lasts. And then as we start to come out of lockdown as restrictions ease, how I'm going to start to reconnect with activities and people and replenish myself over time. And fifthly, I want to mention reactions and responses. I touched on this briefly at the beginning, but this is to say, firstly, that adults and youth and children do react and respond differently for a whole series of reasons. It's important to be aware of this, and it's important to try to find out why a person is reacting in the way that they are. I'm going to talk about how you actually do that in the next section. So having said that, for adults, it's generally a little bit easier to find out what's occurring for them. They'll either tell you because they have the ability to talk and they have relevant language skills and life experience to draw on. I mean, they may not, but if you know a person well, you'll probably notice a change in them and hopefully be able to connect with them and talk to them and ask them what's happening and get some answers. Teenagers, on the other hand, or adolescents, they tend to hang out in their groups and rely on their peers for social support and talk amongst themselves. They won't necessarily talk to their parents. Some will, of course, but they won't necessarily volunteer information unless we ask. And I'll come to a bit more detail about this shortly. In regard to children, though, there are a few key things to keep an eye out for. And you see, with children, because they don't have the range of life experiences to draw on, and because depending on their age, they won't necessarily have the language skills to actually tell us about what's occurring for them internally, there's a tendency to notice there's a tendency for other things to occur. There's 4 or 5 key things that can occur. The first one of those is, and this isn't necessarily in order of priority or anything like that, but the first one is a child that starts to withdraw and disconnect and go inside of themselves, becoming quiet and keeping to themselves. That's one key change or one key marker to keep an eye out for. Another is what we call regression. And regression is a term that refers to the way in which children and young people, but I'll just talk about children in particular now, go back. They seem to go back or take a few steps backwards in terms of their development, their developmental stage. So some examples of that might be a young child who was sleeping in their own room independently, no problems at all, but now is waking up every night wanting to be in mum and dad's room, or not wanting to start off sleeping in their room in the first place. Or a child who was previously going to the toilet on their own with no problems whatsoever, but now seems to be having some of the accidents and the mistakes, frequently or infrequently. Increased clinginess, holding on to mum and dad, is another example of regression, or just wanting to be around them a lot more. So this is another key change, or some types of changes to keep an eye out for. You don't have to become hugely or massively concerned about them, but it's important to read them as an indication that something is going on for that young person. Thirdly, there's something that we call preoccupation. And preoccupation refers to the way in which a young child becomes preoccupied with doing things in a way that are in some way related to what's occurring in their life. And so, of course, not that long ago in June, I think there was the severe weather event. So using that as an example, an instance of preoccupation would be a child playing or acting out the particular storm event. So we'll start to see converted in play and other activities what's on the child's mind or what's preoccupying them at that point in time. Anxiety is something else to keep an eye out for, and anxiety is essentially part of the human body's fear response. Anxiety is worry and concern about what could happen or what might happen. Children can become anxious about all sorts of things. We just need to remember at the moment there's the potential that with the uncertainty and the disruption, children might be feeling the effects of that, either feeling it through the adults that are in their lives or in the atmosphere that's in the home, or they might be picking up on things in another way through the television and catching a little bit of news or overhearing the radio or something like that. And so we might start to see changes in them due to anxiety, talking about fire or the upcoming bushfires, or talking about a fire rating system. Is it going to be a hot day or a bad day as we get closer to that part of the season? And then physical changes is another key area. So, a young child started to talk about the tummy ache or having a headache, those kinds of things. If you're uncertain about if you're uncertain about what you're seeing or noticing, if this is occurring for you, a central question to ask is, did these sorts of things or did these changes exist prior to the pandemic? Or did they exist prior to the severe weather event? Or how long have they been around for? And if they're relatively recent, or if it's really quite clear that they didn't exist prior to these stressful and disruptive events that we're going through now, then more than likely they're being influenced by what's occurring at the moment. Just before we come to the first question, set of questions, first question period, I want to then just touch on what are some of the well-identified, guiding principles to help stabilize and support people across the age range. And so there's 6 I could mention to you at the moment. And even if you were to just focus on these or focus on a few of these, there will undoubtedly be some sort of benefit that's provided. So one of these guiding principles is safety. As humans, it's fundamentally important that we feel safe. It is just a basic need. So anything that we can do to support ourselves or support the important people in our lives to feel safe will go some way to balancing out the effects of disruption or changed assumptions or loss or stress, all those different reactions and responses that I was mentioning. Perspective is something else that is really, really important. And an important perspective, or two important perspectives to try to take on board and try to, as best as you can, have flowing through your day and flowing through your week at some point, as challenging as it might be, optimism and hope. Even though that can really be worn down and broken down over time, and it might on occasions look like there's nothing really left to be optimistic about or to feel hopeful for, perspective is one of the things that we can control. And holding on to that is important. There is just so much information out there that tells us that people who have an optimistic mindset and a hopeful outlook deal with and respond to adversity, and challenge, and traumatic events and big life experiences better. They find their way through them, not necessarily more easily, but they find their way through them and get through to the other side. So perspective is really important, optimism and hope. Thirdly, reducing stress. And of course, I mentioned stress in this endurance mode. But anything also that you can do to start to reduce stress levels, either for yourself as an individual or within your family or for your children, will provide a layer of benefit and help. Fourthly, I want to mention that focusing on what is in your control, not on what is outside of your control, is really important. Of course, this is really relevant at the moment when there is so much going on and so many decisions being made that we don't necessarily have any input into, with so much uncertainty existing in the future. And you see, we've got, well, I'll say a couple of choices. There are probably more than that. But one choice is to either accept that there are things that are not in our control, or to not accept it. The problem is that if we don't accept it, and I don't say this lightly, there can be a tendency to try to push back on it or fight back against it, or to try to re-establish some sort of control over the top of things that are outside of our control. We're sort of, in a way, inevitably going to fail if we adopt that approach. But if we instead try to accept the uncertainty and disruption and things that are outside of our control and focus on what we can control, that will help us. Fifthly, being connected is really important. And again, I know it's hard, even connecting in this sort of way online and not being able to meet with people as regularly in person. But remaining connected is very important, even if it is just online or through a phone call or by a text message, as is feeling supported. And, you know, you can work on that by offering support to people in your lives, but also accepting it and acknowledging it when it's offered to you. So there's sort of 6 key initial guiding principles. As I say, we'll take a bit of a deep dive into more specific ways in which we can support adults and youth and children and families. But I just wanted to lay out, I guess, this sort of background and this context, because it's has been an incredibly disruptive and unsettled time, and we're probably not quite there yet. It probably is a little bit of a way to go the rest of this year, and then a transition into next year where there'll be more change, I'm sure. It's certainly going to get better, absolutely, and we'll start to be able to reconnect with each other soon, but we're not quite there yet. And it's important to realise this, but then bring our focus onto what can we do to either restore health and well-being, and also to make a plan for the future, as well as to support important people in our lives at the moment. So I'm going to just stop there now and come to the first Q&A.
Thanks, David. Yeah, great to just pause and reflect. And I think the key effects and the principles are really, I've written those down, and really good reminder about the state we'll find ourselves in. So we've got a couple of questions that we might look at now, and one is absolutely connected to something you were just talking about, the sense of optimism and hope.
Okay.
So we had a question submitted during the day today with someone writing, I used to be an optimistic person. Now I find I'm expecting things to go wrong. How do I get back to my cheerful, optimistic self?
Yeah, great question. And this will bring us back to, in fact, what I was just talking about or mentioning a moment ago. So I think it's important to say, though, that one of the reasons people lose optimism is because things in their life repetitively start to not turn out well, or to not turn out or go according to plan. And what that can do is grind you down and wear you down over time. And then what comes with that is generally a shift in a person's expectations, and a shift in expectations about what I think is now going to happen the next time. So I go from thinking that, well, bad things don't really happen to me and things usually work out, to thinking, oh, what's the next problem going to be? And, what am I going to have to go through the next time something happens? In fact, I can feel that it's just around the corner. So this comes, given what we need to not do is hang out and wait for the good thing to happen. Because what if it doesn't? What if we're, on a bit of a bad run, which can happen sometimes in life? What we're better off doing, and this is really well identified, is coming back to this idea of perspective, which is one of the key things we can control. And importantly, trying to adopt the perspective of, when the next problem presents itself, adopt the perspective of taking on board the problem as instead a challenge. And more than that, and within that, what can I learn from this challenge, this difficulty that yet again has come into my life? But in this learning, perhaps I can take on board some things that I can apply the next time that actually will make it a bit easier to get through the next time. And then when we repeat that process, what we do, it's each time it's like putting a drop of water in a bucket, and it will start to fill up gradually, and eventually your optimism meter, or your level of optimism, will start to fill up again. So that's one approach to take.
So you mentioned, just following on from that, about recognizing what's not within your control. So is that another useful thing in terms of trying to hang on to your, or rebuild your optimism and hope, fill your bucket up again?
Yeah, absolutely. And, not speaking for everybody out there, but just going on the experiences of the last 18 months with various people and groups and organizations, I think the restrictions and, dare I say it, the roadmap and the plans, what I have been suggesting to people cautiously is, don't pin your personal recovery or your personal health and well-being on things going according to plan. And don't get me wrong, the plans are really important, and they're a guide, and they give us hope, and they're the glimmer of light. But, we need to just remember that a date might not end up being a date. Something could happen and things will change. But if we can accept that that's something outside of our control, and keep focus on what's occurring in us, or in our families, or in the home, or in relationships, when things don't work out the way we'd hoped, it actually won't have so much of an effect on us.
There was another question, which again is related. You talked to earlier about what should we be keeping an eye out for in terms of signals with our children that things maybe aren't going so well, or we need to to think about how we're going to better support them differently. The question that came through was, my daughter would rather not talk to her friends at all if it has to be online, and she seems to be withdrawing. What can I do to help her?
Yeah, and I'm not sure, of course, how old this girl is, but this is something that a lot of young people are experiencing at the moment. This is probably lockdown fatigue, that term that I mentioned, earlier on. What's really important to do is to talk to her, to try to understand. This is really all about getting the inside perspective of what's occurring for the young person. Acknowledging their experience, and if we come back to perspective, instilling hope that it won't always be like this, and instilling hope that not too far off down the track, there'll be the opportunity to connect with friends and peers in person. But then I think what would be really important to let her know is that, well, it's still really important to remain connected with friends. And even though you don't feel like doing it now, you'll probably feel better afterwards, even if it is through a screen. So better off to be connected on some level than not connected at all.
Great, thanks, David. We might leave the questions there and we'll come back. I've got some more, but we'll come back to them perhaps after the next section. So I'll hand back to you. Thanks, David.
Thank you. All right, thanks everyone. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we'll just sort of take a bit of a deep dive now into some more specific techniques and approaches and ways in which to support each other during this experience, and as we move forward, given that we're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. I wanted to touch on firstly a survival kit for parents and carers. And I wanted to, just in starting this part of the conversation off, just ask you to cast your minds back to the time when we used to fly in planes, and we will be doing that again soon. But of course, you'll remember, many of you out there, that when you're sitting in the plane and before it taxis out onto the runway and before takeoff, there's the process of going through the emergency warning. The flight stewards and stewardesses stand up there and they talk about the emergency procedures should something happen with the plane. And one of the things they tell us to do is, if there's an emergency and those oxygen masks drop down from the ceiling in the plane, put that mask onto yourself first before you try to help or tend to or support anyone else. And of course, the reason for that is that, if you're not able to work your way through that particular event, or if you're not conscious, you won't be able to help anyone else. And I wanted to just apply this analogy or this metaphor to adults and looking after the young people in their lives and to families, and also just link this to that heightened state of stress, the endurance mode that I was talking about just a little bit earlier on. I mentioned that with this higher state of stress, there's a tendency to focus on the problems and the challenges, and the difficulties, the things that we're facing, which makes a lot of sense and is to a certain extent really helpful at that time. But what it does is it disconnects us from ourselves. It takes our awareness away from ourselves. Children, young people and children really look to the significant adults and carers in their lives, and they view them as role models and sort of guides, I guess, as to how to deal with challenges and difficulties. And so the example that we set, but also our own health and well-being and where it is at, is actually really important. So a starting point in the survival kit for parents and carers is to put the oxygen mask on to yourself at this point, or to the equivalent is tune into yourself, check in with yourself and see where you're at. Now, there were those other key terms that I mentioned, disruption, for example. Another important tool to put into your survival toolkit is to manage the disruption that's in life. Try to manage it, and by doing that, you'll be able to start to reduce the stress levels. One of the ways that we can do that is to start to re-establish routines. And there's something else I'll touch on in a moment that relates to easing out of lockdown and how we can perhaps start to tackle that as it comes about. But manage the stress by managing the disruption, and manage the disruption by making sure that you've got some good routines in your life. Something then that is also really replenishing and helps to bring energy back into the body and mind and helps support mental health and well-being and reduce things like lockdown is leisure and pleasure. And so for some people, it will have been a long, long time before they had good fun or had a number of enjoyable experiences. But it's important to start to give consideration to them either in terms of how you can still connect with and have enjoyable experiences at this point in time, or how you're going to start to do that as the restrictions ease. What sort of things do you want to, and are you going to be able to start to reconnect with? Which brings me to something else, and that is in terms of the survival kit for parents, to think about, as those restrictions begin to reduce and ease, to think about reconnecting with prior activities and social events gradually. And not necessarily, although you can, but not necessarily trying to snap everything back really quickly to the way it was a few months ago, or 6 months ago, or 12 months ago, to sort of be kind to yourself and just ease into things, and give yourself time again to start to adapt. There's this, I guess, another description that we use sometimes, or another analogy that's used sometimes, that relates to the fuel tanks in a car, or in fact those cars that have 2 fuel tanks. You've got the main tank that you use, which sometimes if you drive a long distance, you'll need to then flick the switch on the dashboard and start to draw on the tank in the reserve. What we've been going through over the last 18 months is, a bit like, or very much like, using up all the fuel in the main tank and then starting to draw on the reserve. So again, there's this very important sort of issue and idea and aim of starting to fill that fuel tank up again, fill that reserve tank up, and then start to fill the main fuel tank up again. And we do that by these things I've mentioned: bringing awareness back to self, managing the disruption, lowering stress levels, re-involving ourselves in things that bring about leisure and pleasure, and then back to perspective again, hope and optimism for the future. And hope and optimism for the future with an awareness that there's probably going to be a moving into a new normal. A lot of things will go back to the way they were, but then there are going to be aspects of life that will be quite different for a long time yet, hence the term, or that being the reason for the term, the new normal, which is a term that has been around in the natural disaster area for well over 10 years. And that comes from the experience of working with communities and people that have had really big life events and life experiences. Also, recovery from losses. Part of moving into the new normal is accepting that we might not be able to get everything back. And then also for parents, 2 more things. One, the golden rule of leading by example. And then secondly, paying attention to what the atmosphere is in the home. And if you remember some of those 6 guiding principles, safety and security and reduced stress levels, having a calm, sort of open, collaborative atmosphere in the home where people can talk and get along. Although as I say this, I realise it's not going to be like that all of the time, but paying attention to the levels of stress that might be there. So there's some key things for parents and adults to pay attention to as we sort of move forward, I think, through the remainder of this year and then begin to move into next year. In regard to children, if you just briefly cast your mind back to those particular changes that I mentioned to keep an eye out for: withdrawal and regression, preoccupation, anxiety, and physical. So just sort of hold those in your mind. And then remember those points that I made about children reacting and responding differently to teenagers and also to adults, and the reasons for that, mainly to do with their developmental stage, their personality and temperament, and also their life experiences and use of language. And then realize that what becomes really important is to understand the young person's experience. So if you've noticed any of those changes, and the way we do that is through conversation. And the conversation can be, although it certainly doesn't have to be, a deliberate attempt to find out what's happened, but in doing that, picking your moment and a couple of terms to remember that can guide you if you want to try to talk to a young child and find out what their experience is. Inquisitive questioning, that's an approach to take. But just also realize that when children are relaxed, when they're playing, perhaps also when they're a little bit more tired at the end of the day, in bed, a bedtime story, that can be the time that they start to open up as well. And that can give you an insight into what's occurring in their world. When they do start to do that, and you start to catch a glimpse of or understand what their perspective is, try to answer or solve any questions or problems or concerns that they have. Think about, the importance of re-establishing safety and security. That's what's really important. And children, again, don't have this ability to draw on a whole collection of life experiences to decide for themselves that they're safe and secure or that everything will turn out okay in the end. And so, again, they turn to the adults in their lives to support them with this, but not all children will openly talk about what's occurring for them. I just also wanted to mention that, bearing in mind the easing out of restrictions and the return to school in term 4, the gradual staggered return to school, that I think we should be aiming for a soft landing rather than a hard landing. And what I mean by that is gradually and supportively touching down, gradually and supportively getting back to those old routines that wrapped up going to school, getting ready in the morning, going to school for the day, coming home, perhaps preparing the night before, all of those things that go along with it. And also bearing in mind that because the last 18 months has been so disrupted, we're probably going to, we know that we're already seeing social and emotional effects and impacts on children, and that some children are also experiencing learning and academic challenges. Bearing that in mind, and then given what we also know and understand about child development and learning processes, what we are suggesting now is to place a focus on the social and emotional areas in a child's life over and above the academic. The academic is absolutely still important, but there isn't so much of a need for it to be the key priority at the moment. So what I want to do in mentioning this is to lessen parental or carer concern about where children are at the moment, because what could actually make it harder for them to adjust and harder to work through and come to terms with these challenges and difficulties that we've all found challenging and difficult are additional pressures to catch up academically. It's probably, given the length of time that this event has been going on, important to think about a longer time of recovery, or allowing a longer period of time for recovery. So not trying to rush them to get completely caught up and up to date by the end of term 4, but maybe thinking that this is going to take term 4 and into next year to happen in the academic area. But if we support them socially and emotionally, that's actually the foundation that will enable them to work through more successfully that process of catching up and getting up academically. So bear those things in mind as well. If I then touch on youth and supporting youth, so it's now, unfortunately, I guess, although we always knew that young people, teenagers and adolescents were going to be affected quite significantly by COVID and by lockdowns and restrictions, now the evidence is in, and that has become really, really clear that that's the case for many, not for all though, but for some of them. And an important thing to just, I guess, check in and realize is that being a teenager, and if you think back even to your adolescence, it's a phase of life that involves socializing with your peers, hanging out in groups with your mates and your friends. And it involves lots of rites of passage and firsts, formals, for example, and other activities. So lots of firsts. And overall, finding my place in the world, and finding more out about who I am. It's this transitionary phase between childhood and adulthood. And so this is why the disconnection socially has been so tough for many young people. You know, they've ended up feeling very isolated, although thank goodness for technology. That's certainly been one benefit that we've all had. And so for adults and parents and carers to be able to help, they really need to understand you know, how their teenager is managing or not managing. And that again comes through conversation and language and talking. And we need to let them know we need to let them know that it's okay to not be okay and that it's okay to talk. And importantly, we need to create time and space in the home and in the family atmosphere and environment to talk and to promote talking and conversation. That becomes really, really important. Listen to their perspective, understand it, value it, help them regain a healthy perspective if needed. Some other suggestions though are to be patient, be supportive, and also pick your battles, make allowances. It's also, you know, very, very important. Now, if your teenager is struggling, or if you've noticed challenges that if you can see that they've been having challenges, you know, now might not be the time to pick the battle of whether they've made their bed or not. You know, that might be something that is okay for the time being to just let slide. You know, focus on the other important priorities, keeping that connection with them and tuning into their needs. And then I just want to touch on families lastly before we come to some further Q&A. And again, just ask you to take your mind back to those 6 key guiding principles of safety, optimism and hope, reducing stress, focusing on what's in our control, being connected and feeling supported. And then I want to add to that this suggestion that for parents, carers, grandparents even, that when there are young people in our lives, something else that we can do, and this is helpful to strengthen and build and instill resilience, is to model confidence, optimism and courage. You know, they're 3 important qualities and characteristics to have that certainly add or contribute to more resilient responding amidst stress and difficulty and adversity. But I also want to mention that vulnerability is something else important to show. Again, this it's okay to not be okay idea. And by showing your children that you're vulnerable and talking to them about what's happening, you actually build up inside of them a reference in regard to what it is like to go through a difficult, challenging life experience and how you work through it. You know, they'll start to think at some point in their future. When we were going through the pandemic, and Mum talked to me a little bit about what it was like for her, but what she was doing to get through it, that made a lot of sense to me. And actually now I can draw on that and use it in my life with whatever difficulty or challenge I'm going through at the moment. So confidence, optimism and courage, but also vulnerability are important. 2 other suggestions, and one is that in all of this, and again, coming back to perspective, making meaning from the pandemic is important. This shouldn't be and doesn't have to be about everything being bad. The way to get something out of problems is to view them as a challenge that is to be overcome and worked through. The way to get something out of a big life experience is to make meaning and sense out of it and come to understand what it meant for me or what it meant for our family. Yeah, how we worked through that together. How did we acknowledge what was occurring for us? How did we identify the problems and the difficulties? What did we learn through this? And how can we draw on those learnings the next time that we go through something difficult? So think about these conversations, or having conversations that incorporate these sorts of things as well. And then just fourthly, again, I wanted to touch on this idea or concept of moving into the new normal. rather than a return to everything being exactly the way it once was. And I just want to encourage you all out there to gradually think about this if you haven't already, and gradually start to consider coming to terms with that and accepting that. One of the things, as something else that we've come to recognize and see many times over, is that the people, irrespective of age almost, that recover the best from challenging, difficult life events are those people that are able to adjust and adapt in the moment and incorporate some of these guiding principles. But they're also the people that are able to come to terms with quite often the fact or the harsh reality that not everything will go back to exactly the way it once was. You know, we'll be living with some level of restrictions for some time yet, but that actually doesn't have to take away from our ability to focus on those things that are in our control, and to invest in those things that are actually going to replenish our lives and keep our lives meaningful and purposeful. So I think it's important to consider this and just bear it in mind over the next 3 or 4 months. And then as we move into 2022 and perhaps find ourselves in a slightly different place and space, making some more adjustments, but, you know, well and truly coming out, hopefully, out of lockdown and restrictions and hibernation, and re-involving ourselves in the world. Perhaps one last comment is that we can perhaps anticipate that as this starts to happen, people will begin to talk. You know, you'll begin to talk with friends that you haven't caught up with for a while. Kids will start to catch up with their friends and talk amongst themselves across the age range. There'll be a lot of just wanting to talk and catch up. And for some people, amidst all of that, although there'll be a lot of positive things going along and a lot of fantastic, happy, joyful conversations, there will be people that start to talk about challenges and difficulties and what's been hard for them. You don't have to jump in and solve people's problems. Just being a listening ear, letting them know that you're listening, letting them know that you're there to support them, and offer a helping hand if needed, can really go a long way to helping people feel safe, secure, connected, and as if they belong. So that will bring us, I think, to the second set of questions. As we work towards concluding this particular session.
Thanks, David. Some really good strategies there. Thank you for sharing those with us. Again, we've got questions that are really connected into things that you've already talked about, which is great. One of them is, and it's certainly an experience I have struggled with, particularly with, my younger children. Some days the children are really reluctant to, do their WebExes and log on. How do you get the balance right? And you mentioned, the focus is probably more on well-being at the moment, but not putting aside, school. And I guess as a parent, for me, it feels that connection with their classmates and their teacher is a really critical thing. So how do you kind of juggle that and deal with that on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I think if you have any control over it, then keeping the connection up between your child and between their friends and classmates is important. So I'm thinking here outside of school time, if possible, but with an awareness of not overdoing it because of the excess screen time, I guess, that's going on at the moment. But, just try to set up informal catch-ups with friends. That's important. But I'm thinking about this for those people out there whose school or within the online classroom, that might not be happening a lot. So if that's the case, then the outside of school catch-ups are really important. But again, yes, so again, what I'll do is I'll bring it back to the focus on the social emotional, and as best as you can within, I know there are the school and the curriculum requirements, being a little bit more flexible with those and picking your battles. Yeah, I think if your child is really struggling on a particular day or at a particular point in time, there's a point where you can start to just let that go because the circumstances are quite unique. and perhaps face those things the next day. But I'm saying all of this within reason, of course. But this is very much the suggestion at the moment, the support, the attunement between parents and child, between the teacher and the class and student, and the ongoing focus on the social and emotional aspects. And I think in particular, as we work our way into term 4, just being prepared to gradually ease ourselves back into things along with the children. Yeah.
I have a couple more questions that are from me, actually, David. So how important is routine for the children and for all of us at the moment?
Yeah, it's really important. Routines bind life together. And again, there's lots of information and lots of research out there to say that families, for example, who have routines around eating together or doing things together are healthier and happier in a whole range of areas. So routines are actually really important. But so is flexibility and an awareness of rigidity or inflexibility. So there's this important issue of finding the balance between routines whilst being flexible and not clinging to the routines, as a way to just manage all of the uncertainty. We still need to have routines, but we still need to have flexibility so that there's time to do fun things. And for instance, just not follow everything according to a predetermined plan, which might, for an adult, minimize the disruption and the stress, but for a child might be really tiring and not fun at all. But fundamentally, routines are really important.
And last question, and again, this is one that came up in talking to a group of, like me, working parents who, there's that constant juggle of whether it's homeschooling or at the moment now it's school holidays and spending a lot of time ourselves in Zoom meetings and, trying to do the things we need to in the day and the amount of screen time our children are having. So the question is, is there a kind of a perfect number we should be aiming for in terms of getting the balance right with our children and, screen time and boundaries in terms of the amount of screen time that they have?
Yeah, there are some numbers out there, although off the top of my head, I can't remember what they are. But there was
Sorry, David.
No, that's okay. But there was a study not that long ago, last year, I think, which off the top of my head was 2 or 3 hours a day. So we'd be well and truly over that at the moment, of course, with home-based learning. So maybe what we could also do here is think about, as these restrictions ease and as we move more into the the warmer weather of spring and into summer, the real importance of kids getting outside. And actually, if I could mention something here, which is a fundamentally important need of child development, spontaneity and play. And working to create opportunities that will enable them to be involved in that. That might take a little bit of adjustment as well with kids. Yeah.
Thank you very much for spending the evening with us, David. And I'm sure that those who joined us found it as useful as I did. It certainly has been and continues to be a really challenging time for all of us, and understanding the reactions that we're having and ways to think about both how to respond now, but how to better prepare for whatever comes next. I think your advice around reconnecting gently is something I will take with me. And I thought about that this week when I took my children to the playground, and one of them, very confident normally, was anxious about being around so many children.
That's right.
Yeah. That was a reminder about just that need to gently step back in. Yeah. So thank you very much, David, and thank you for those that joined us this evening. We have recorded this session and it will be up on the Yarra Ranges Council website in the support section. So if there's anyone who you think might benefit from watching it, there's also a full range of resources up on that website, including numbers for all types of support that you might need, whether it's storm recovery or other pandemic recovery elements. Thank you again, David, and thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Take care and stay safe. Thank you.